Good afternoon, everybody. I'm John Pinching, editor of Pharma Times, and your host for Accelerating Patient Recruitment in Clinical Trials Post-COVID-19. The healthcare ecosystem is evolving rapidly. The digital era, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, and above all, patients being far more invested in their own health has created a new dynamic between pharma, public health, and the public itself. These complex relationships have also meant that clinical trials have had to reinvent, reboot, and redesign. The essential participation required to develop life-transforming therapies needs bold innovation, an appreciation of the modern patient, and an awareness of how diversity, inclusion, and local knowledge can ignite a new generation of clinical trials. Mercifully, we have a number of experts today who are going to guide you to the promised land of patient recruitment in new clinical trials. We're starting off with founder of Innovative Trials, Kate Shaw, who will talk to you about how patient recruitment was affected during the pandemic. Next up is Jane Thurston, Senior Patient Recruitment Lead at Parksall, who will be discussing the challenges in recruiting patients following COVID-19. After that, Whitney Tainton from Innovative Trials will describe the boots-on-the-ground approach via Clinical Enrollment Managers. Jane and then Whitney will return with some notable success stories thereafter. We'll then wrap things up with a Q&A session. With this in mind, please feel free to submit questions to our panel throughout the presentations. Please be aware that there'll also be a few exciting polling questions during the webinar, so keep your fingers on your buzzers. Okay, it's now time for me to pass the controls over to Kate.
Thank you, John. So thank you for joining us today, everyone. We're really looking forward to sharing our thoughts and findings with you over the next 45 minutes or so. We really want to hear your thoughts though, and so we're going to have two polling questions to start, really, so we can set the scene and understand kind of how everyone else is feeling with patient recruitment post-COVID. Just to start with, I'll quickly go through our agenda. So we'll be, like I said, discussing patient recruitment. Jane will then be jumping in, talking about kind of her experiences and the challenges that she's faced. Whitney will go through our CEMs, and we'll go back to understand more about PartCell and kind of what PartCell has been finding in the last few months. And then we'll go through a case study from our side as well. Like John said, it is a live Q&A, and so if you've got any questions, please post them to us. Okay, so over to the polling questions. So our first question, has patient recruitment become more challenging since COVID-19? If you'd please like to vote yes or no, and then we can share our findings. So you've got about a minute to vote. Please go ahead. Okay, have we got any votes coming in?
Okay, looks like we're still waiting for a few votes to come in. And we're trending on the yes side, Kate.
We are. So yeah, thanks, Whitney. So results on that, 100% people saying that recruitment has been more of a challenge since COVID. So yeah, really interesting. I think probably none of us are surprised by this at all. And so by the next, we're going to go through, hopefully give you some hints and tips on how we can really help to promote patient recruitment post-COVID. So thank you so much for voting. Moving on to poll 2. So again, are you finding that your studies are falling behind due to delays in patient recruitment? I think patient recruitment has always been a challenge in clinical research, but are you finding at the moment your studies are falling behind due to delays? So again, if you please vote, that would be fantastic. We've got a few more seconds. Please keep voting. Okay, we're still open for a few more votes.
And Kate, for this poll, you're flagging at 94% yes, with 5%, now 95 yes, and 5% no.
Thanks, Whitney.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're in the right place then. This is exactly what we're here to discuss. And so we'll take you through some kind of reasons and hopes where we can help to improve recruitment on your studies. So I'd like to hand over to Jane. Thank you for voting, everybody.
Hi, and thank you, Kate, very much. I'm not surprised by any of the responses, quite frankly. I think what we've seen since COVID is, especially the lack of patients of color who were willing to participate in clinical trials for any of the vaccines. A high percentage of patients of color dying from COVID because they were afraid to get, vaccinated. And that stems from, what has occurred historically in the past to patients of color in clinical trials. I'm sure that, most of the people who are joining on this webinar have heard of Tuskegee, and that's just one to name many of, unfortunately, some of the atrocities that occurred. So sponsors are now seeing that there's a need to have more diversity in trials, but the struggle is that so many patients of color are fearful, and rightfully so, of participating because they don't want to be made to be guinea pigs, or they're afraid that because they're, of color, that they'll be the ones that get the placebo versus, people, who are Caucasians. We've also seen that there are just not enough doctors and physicians and investigators of color. In fact, there's the lowest percentage of patients of color, of doctors wanting to enter med school of color. It's an appalling rate. And again, from surveys that have been conducted, we know that patients of color feel that they get better treatment and want to see doctors who look like them. And there, again, is some truth to that in things, again, surveys that have been conducted, that they're not incorrect in believing that they don't get the same kind of treatment by doctors, who are Caucasian, because, everyone has, built-in biases. And we also have seen that, there's a lack of sites that have diverse patient populations. Typically, sponsors always want to go to large institutions, but that leaves out a lot of community sites where you have a larger, patient population, with different ethnicities and races. And so that makes it a struggle when you're trying to have representation. Another thing, again, is there is a big problem with staffing since COVID at these sites. We're seeing that, all the time. There's a lot of turnover with study coordinators. Sites are still struggling to get back up to the staffing where they were. That puts additional pressure on sites when they're trying to, recruit, especially studies that are difficult, that have a lot of complexities. Another challenge that we face is getting doctors to even see clinical trials as a treatment option, solution for patients. And so education is really needed. We can't assume that doctors, know about clinical trials and that they're up on everything, or that they're even telling their patients about clinical trials, because unfortunately that doesn't happen. Again, especially with patients of color. And, decentralized trials became very popular during COVID, and they definitely serve a purpose and can be very, helpful to patients in reducing burden. However, they aren't great for every study. So you can't make every trial decentralized, because some really do require those patients going in and seeing that investigator. And also, some of the things that the tools that are used, like home nursing. We say, well, we'll have the home nurse go to the patients so they don't have to come to the sites. However, we've also seen that that there's only a 23% uptake of patients who are really utilizing that. Again, it comes back to a lot of patients, especially patients of different, cultures. There's a stigma in having home nursing come to you. There's also, some people feel embarrassed about having nurses come into their home. So there's a lot of reasons why this is not always, while it sounds good, doesn't always actually in reality work. So that's just some of the things that we've been seeing since, COVID, especially in the clinical trial arena.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jane. So moving into post-pandemic recruitment acceleration, I think that it's really important to just recognize that patient recruitment now in 2022 is not what it was several years ago. It's definitely become more challenging. And I think it is going to take years to rebound from the pandemic and the issues that it brought to surface. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, what we have learned, and I can speak to this myself, just speaking with sites directly, is that they have been very burdened as far as lack of resource. Perhaps their employees that were assigned to their research unit had now been moved over to other units within the hospital or their site or their healthcare system to support where help was needed. I think there's also been a lot of regulations that have come about during the pandemic. And it's truly made us realize, as Jane mentioned, that decentralized studies are needed. So if you look at the flexibility piece, the flexibility not only extends to patients and to sites, but there's many barriers that have come to surface around flexibility. So you might hear us talk about this later on, but perhaps it's offering early appointments or later appointments, or recognizing that there has to be more flexibility around patients and recruiting them as subjects on clinical trials. With the sites dynamics, I think that a lot of sites are operating very differently than what they were several years back. Some of the changes that we've seen come to our sites that we support have been very abrupt. So it's important to note that sites have to be fluid in their approach on clinical trials and recruiting patients. And so the fluid situation has to extend also to from ourselves and our clinical enrollment managers, but also to CROs and sponsors. Next are the solutions. So I think it's incredibly important to remember that what we noticed during the pandemic is that the day-to-day is just so rapidly changing. So what might be the situation one day is not the situation the next. And the pivotal solutions that exist around patient recruitment are needed in order to maximize success. And so one of the solutions that Innovative has been supporting sites with is just our Clinical Enrollment Managers, or CEMs. What you might see throughout this presentation, in fact, is that our Clinical Enrollment Managers have been able to help sites overcome their recruitment hurdles and promote positive outcomes. And with that, I'll move into our next slide. So a CEM, or Clinical Enrollment Manager, I know it's a long acronym there for one of the individuals on our team, but they're truly special individuals that provide a bespoke relationship with research sites. It is a one-on-one relationship, and I can definitely speak to this from both sides, because back when I was a study coordinator, I received services from a Clinical Enrollment Manager at Innovative Trials as a study coordinator. So these CEMs are in-country specialists who have cultural knowledge. I always like to say it's like your neighbor calling from just around the corner rather than someone calling from outside of the country. They provide both virtual and in-person support, and they do have experience as physicians, research nurses, study coordinators, CRAs, and clinical trial managers. What a CEM can do is quite broad. In fact, it is definitely, like I said, a special relationship with the sites. It's about the relationship building, because we know that sites that feel well supported recruit extremely well compared to those that maybe are a little bit demotivated, in fact. So with this CEM support, we're able to engage with the sites and keep that momentum up to support their needs. I bring all of this, out in attention here because what we know about our CEMs is that they can provide those pivotal solutions. They can meet sites where they are at in order to help them in their recruitment journey. So with the CEM service overall, it is a boots on the ground approach. It is literally a support person in country who can provide knowledge around the dynamics, especially with COVID-19 and post-pandemic recruitment acceleration. Again, meeting those sites where they're at in their recruitment journey to accelerate patient recruitment. Jane?
Thank you. So we mentioned, the challenges, and this is, really where clinical enrollment managers have really been very helpful, especially in, a lot of the trials that I work on. Working on pre-award, it's our job to mitigate any of the risks around patient recruitment and retention. And as you can see from this slide, we know that sites that have clinical enrollment management support versus sites that don't, there's a huge difference. We actually compared 12 different studies. And as you can see, all these different indications, constipation, Alzheimer's, ulcerative colitis, so, cancer, so very, very different studies. And you can see the screening rates versus the randomization. And so we know that sites that have this resource actually screen at a 28%, average. And again, this is just over 12 studies. It's much higher on specific studies, but we have a higher screening rate. And then we have a 38% higher randomization rate. And truthfully, that's because the way CEMs function is that they really can provide so many different types of services that are tailor-made to what the site needs. And so it varies very much on a site-by-site, country-by-country level on what CEMs will do. And that's really the strength, I think, in what this brings to sites and to studies, is that you can really have them tailor make whatever is really something that a specific site is lacking. Maybe as I spoke about earlier, the bandwidth, they don't have enough staff to actually go and do any outreach, which a lot of times is required because there's just not enough, staff that can actually go out and help build that external referral database. And so, we know that trials struggle because, oftentimes based on the protocol of a study, on the inclusion and exclusion, these sites may not have all of those patients in that database, even though they initially think that they will for a study. When it comes to, then building it in that inclusion and exclusion, they can go from thinking they have 100 potential patients to 1. And that 1 may not be interested in participating in a trial. And again, hence that's where you have these lags in clinical studies and trouble with, enrollment, and why you have studies that need to be rescued. So that can be avoided when you bring in those clinical enrollment managers from the very beginning to provide those resources. And then, these are just some specific case studies. I talked about some of the challenges we're seeing around diversity, equity, and inclusion in trials, especially now that, sponsors are realizing and recognizing and really being encouraged. I know here in the US, especially by the FDA, they've developed new guidance around really encouraging sponsors to look at studies, especially studies that are for diseases that mostly impact patients of color. And this is one study that we did regarding lupus, which again is predominantly a disease that affects mostly patients that are Black or Asian. And this is the success that we actually saw, as you can see, in having what we call community outreach. And it really does help because, again, is that something that most sites can provide? It isn't. And so you can have actually clinical enrollment managers go out, call on, key opinion leaders, reverends of churches where we know they have very strong ties with the community and patients of color. They can go to small businesses of color to get the word out about clinical trials. And so again, we know that having that kind of community outreach is very, very effective in reaching these patient populations. So again, that is something that I am now really looking at when proposals come in on my end in pre-award, and looking at the prevalence of patients who are affected by that disease and saying, is this something that really is going to be beneficial by bringing in CEMs, because we know they can do this kind of outreach. And as I said, we do know that it works, as you can see from this particular study. They were able to visit over 40 sites. They were able to get out over 3,000 brochures, distribute 200 posters. And this was really helpful in being able to randomize on average one patient per site, which may not sound, like a lot, but it really is, especially when we already know there's a challenge in getting the patients of color to enroll to begin with in clinical trials, or even having anyone talk to them about the opportunity of participating. So next slide actually is a case study that I want to share. And this is one that I actually worked on as a clinical enrollment manager. I was brought in to work on a trial that was in rescue mode for a chronic kidney disease, and it was an injectable iron product. And at first I was just given low enrolling sites in Florida. And a lot of times, again, I think that there is a thought that CRAs are the same as clinical enrollment managers, and the roles that we play are vastly different. And so when I went out to these sites that were struggling, the first thing I did was set up a meeting, and I sat down with them and asked them what was working, what wasn't, what had worked in the past. And I actually spent an hour at each of these sites that were non-enrollers and talked to them and heard them and listened to what they were telling me that their challenges and struggles were. And then I went back and developed very specific site strategies. That's something that CRAs, again, just can't perform because they have so many sites that they're covering. And I was then able to take back to the sponsor, who happened to be par excel at the time. I wasn't actually working for them. And I was able to give them insights into why these sites were non-enrollers. And they also saw that once I had worked with them and developed these plans, there was a complete uptake in these sites randomizing and enrolling. I had weekly engagement with these sites. They knew that I was engaged. And I will tell you, in 6 months, I took a study that was at 530 patients to over 1,538. They were happily surprised and very, very pleased at the success of being able to bring this trial in to, fruition. And again, that is just because of the functions that CEMs really are able to provide, is that true one-on-one working with sites. Next study is showing the CEM impact on screening rate over time. And you can see this was a phase 3 study that was actually, it coincided with the impact of COVID, which we, of course, are talking about. And of course, there was a drop in screening during, all of, the pandemic, taking place. Patients were afraid to leave their houses. They were not wanting to go to visits at sites where there were other patients that possibly they could, get infected by. And, but we saw that despite the the impact of the pandemic on screening, we actually know that the sites that were receiving CEM support actually continued to have higher screening rates. Again, because they were doing that one-on-one with the sites, they were able to, again, when sites were struggling with having, staff, that were sick because they were, getting COVID, that they could then fill in and perform those functions, doing that pre-screening, doing those chart reviews, so that sites were not as suffering as much as other sites that did not have that support. So we do know, that sites with CEM support definitely screen at a higher rate, and it shows that these sites do maintain higher levels of engagement simply because of that CEM and enrollment. So again, we just know that CEMs really are a valuable resource in clinical trials. And now I will turn it over to Whitney again.
Thank you, Jane. So we picked a case study around flu, and you might ask, why in the world would you pick a case study around flu? The reason behind that is because of the challenges. I think it's really important to highlight studies that are difficult, and they're going to be difficult before you even take on that challenge. And so with this study in particular, a flu study, some of the things that I would like to just talk about before I go through the case study is that we were in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I guess it's fair to say now we're kind of on the outskirts of that. However, this is an interim analysis for a study that is still actually going on. What we have found with this study in particular and other studies that Innovative Trials has taken on over the last few years is that there are a lot of challenges with flu studies, because you don't just have flu, you have RSV, you have the common cold, you have COVID-19. And so with this, we found that a lot of patients who had these symptoms go, oh no, I have symptoms of COVID-19. I'm going to have a test completed or rapid at home. And then if I'm not COVID positive, I'm going to carry on with my life, regardless of if I'm contagious with the flu, the common cold, RSV, and so forth. So with this study in particular, it was that dynamic that we knew was going to be challenging and proved to be true. But as you can imagine, we had completed quite a bit of flu surveillance for this program. So actually looking at a long list of countries and pulling data from week to week to support our strategy and our recruitment platform. It's really important when you look at the patient recruitment and retention space and you're recommending strategy to be equipped with as much data as you can to support that strategy. So perhaps if one country increases in the number of cases, then we need to increase support in those areas and perhaps decrease as if the flu cases also decrease in another area. So with this, we found that a lot of patients perhaps maybe had flu but weren't reporting, because if they weren't COVID positive, they kind of just left it as is. And it did bring a lot of challenges for us. It required certain types of patients on this program to include household patients and also to the initial patient. And with this, we found that with the implementation of our CEM calls, that we were able to actually turn really good results. So as you can see, we had 8 countries, phase 3B, 95 sites. We found that we were able to increase the screening rate by 81%, randomization rate 32%, and flip sites 26.3%. To me, one of the most important statistics here on the screen is the 26.3%. So what that means is that these sites had no patient recruitment activity. And with the implementation of our services and our remember, unique site-tailored support, we were able to get 26.3 of those percent of those sites recruiting and actually, finding these patients and doing something. It's important here to see that the CEM sites actually screened 90% higher than CEM sites, and 65% of the patients were screened by our CEM sites themselves. Here are some charts. I like to show data in several different ways, and I think it's important to just recognize that some people, take in data when it's spoken or on a screen, and then others like to see it visually. So with this on the screen, you're going to see just a certain period of this program. In fact, we were able to kind of split it apart to just look at when CEM support was relevant. So with the 2021-2022 flu season, 528 patients were screened, and of those patients, 65% were again screened by the CEM sites and 35% by non-CEM sites. So you can see that it is a significant difference that when you do implement that CEM support and the sites have someone not just to be their cheerleader and their motivator, but someone to give them real examples and recommendations on what they should do next. I think what we find, especially with difficult studies, is that it's easy to get to a roadblock and sort of panic. What do I do next? I have no clue. I'm exhausted. I've looked through my database. We're reviewing the schedule. What do we do? And it's nice to have someone to hear you out, but to be able to say, you know what? It's okay. Let's figure this out together. Let's talk about it and let's set goals. Goal setting in the patient recruitment space has become extremely significant during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And I'm not talking about contractual goals. I'm talking about goals with someone who is supporting you like a CEM to say, hey, you know what? I know you're exhausted. Can you commit to just reviewing 5 charts in the next week? So it's finding ways to meet sites where they're at in their journey and being able to set those goals that are realistic and achievable. The next graph on the screen here is that you'll see that the average screening rate for a CEM site was 3.97 patients, and for non-CEM sites, the average was 2.19. So this here is an 81% increase, and as you can see, that these CEM sites were able to screen more patients than those non-CEM sites. So actual individuals, when you calculate out the metrics to see how the performance went. So for me, it's really important to talk about what can I leave you with? What can our team on the line, what can we give to you to take back to implement in your day-to-day? So we have recommendations split out for sponsors and CROs and then for sites. And I'm going to talk through with you. Please submit questions if you have them. We would love to answer them. But there's 3 words that I want to leave you with for each of these slides. So for sponsors and CROs, it's analyze, reassess, and amend. And with this, when you think about analyzing your patient recruitment and retention strategy, the one thing I would say is listen to sites that are jumping up and down and saying, hey, we have these issues. Someone please call us. This is not working. Sites that are known in the space or even new sites. It's interesting to see what sites have to say because their value in the conversations is unbeatable. These sites have direct lines to these patients. They hear what the patients are saying. They hear why patients are not interested in participation or the struggles that they find with eligibility criteria. So listen to your sites and be flexible. I would encourage you, if you're a sponsor or a CRO, to just remember that flexibility is so incredibly important, especially after the pandemic. It's important to be able to think outside of the box and to be able to provide resources and recommendations that are perhaps not the tried and true method. We have found over here at Innovative Trials that we have to be shockingly innovative in our approach to patient recruitment, and that there has been plenty of different strategies that we've been able to say, maybe in the past, that might not be that possible. And then today we have to look at it in a different dynamic and say, you know what? I think we can do this. We can make this strategy happen. So I would encourage you to listen, to be flexible, and be creative. Remember that every study is different. So what you did on a breast cancer study 3 years ago might not work today. What you do on oncology studies might not work PED studies. So just be creative in your approach. I encourage you to have brainstorms. It's really interesting to get together a lot of different people to see how their thinking patterns work and what you can come up with. And it is okay to be creative. It is okay to try something new. In this kind of pattern here, it's important to reassess. I think a lot of times we get studies that are pilots, we get studies that are in rescue, and it's really interesting to see that the strategy that has been brought to the table for a study in the beginning and how that's been reassessed along the way. So what you might find is that the strategy that you initially came up with as a team and that you've implemented and you have a plan for, and perhaps contingencies along the way, might be something that you have to rearrange or you have to throw things out and start over again. And that is okay too. Reassessing the patient recruitment needs and retention too of a program is critical from start to finish. The reason behind this is because you don't know what might come up. Hopefully not another pandemic. Perhaps you might have more competing studies, or maybe there's more hype around something in the media that brings attention to your therapeutic area and your clinical trial space. Alongside of this, I would encourage you to amend where necessary, promote sharing of your barriers and trends. This is something that we do. We support quite a few countries at innovative trials, and so we do have experience on the global platform. And what we find is that sometimes in certain countries, it might be that they have not experienced this barrier yet. And I say yet because it almost always seems that the barriers do flow through the countries. It comes down to the word when. Not yet, but when. And so I would encourage you to have open conversations across your teams and your countries. Don't just kind of stick them each in a little bucket by themselves. We're all here for the same goal. And the more information that you can share about your difficulties, your struggles, and your solutions and your strategies, the more success that you will have on these studies that you oversee. I think it's also extremely important to just acknowledge and appreciate your sites. Sites have been incredibly resilient during the pandemic and have been the face of a lot of these clinical trials that have taken place. As I mentioned, they're the direct line to patients. They have to put on that happy face to talk about clinical trials and to show that that they're happy and positive despite the 100 charts they need to review in 30 minutes and the 15 phone calls that they need to respond to. So please extend the appreciation to your sites for being positive and for being tenacious. Our sites are incredibly important, and the work that they do is just so significant for clinical trials and patient recruitment success. So for my sites, my heart goes out to you. As I mentioned, I have a background as a study coordinator in an OBGYN clinic. It was some of the most difficult work I have ever done. So thank you for being resilient and for always finding a way and for working with us. I know I can speak for the industry as a whole that we're grateful for each of you and the work that you do. The 3 words for sites are realistic, proactive, and productive. Okay. And again, it's important to leave you with something so that when you do get to these roadblocks, you think, what do I do? They mentioned this. Let me go back and look at those slides. So being realistic, okay? One of my rules of thumb here is that I never advise my team or sites when I speak with them of a tactic or strategy or goal that I would not be willing to do myself. And the reason behind that is because that's just not fair. So I think it's important to be realistic, okay? What can a site do in an amount of time? What is a realistic goal, okay? So I would encourage you to block time for your recruitment activities, okay? It is really easy for a calendar to fill up with meetings and phone calls and this and that and the other, but block your time. Your time is sacred. So if you block it, it is protected, and it allows you the breathing room to be able to actually complete those recruitment activities. So an example of that might be you set a goal and say, I'm going to review 10 charts today. So you've blocked out enough time that you think it'll take, add on 25% extra time for anything that might come up, and then you'll be able to complete that with ease. You'll be able to take a few breaths along the way, and it'll be an easy check in the box for you. I don't think that anyone has ever said this to me in my career, so I'm going to say it today. Failure is okay. Okay? Failure is okay. It is okay for a tactic to not work. It is okay for it to not yield any patients. It is okay that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. Failure is okay. What is important is how you rebound from those failures. So, okay, maybe going out and visiting 10 physicians didn't work. It didn't yield any patients. They were not interested. You feel a little down after that because it wasn't incredibly positive. That's okay. How can we pivot? Maybe we're going to reach out to clinics in the network. Maybe we're going to have our PI ring a few friends in the industry. Failure is okay. Your rebound is important. Back to setting the small, achievable, realistic goals. I think it's important as sites and also to just an industry for us to recognize that time is limited. Time is so sacred. So when you are setting your goals as a site, and this is something that we do, in fact, work with our CEMs on, is that small goals that are achievable and realistic often motivate a site. It kind of goes around in a circle, if you will. So maybe a little demotivated. You set these small goals. It makes you feel more confident, like, hey, I've got this. We can do this. And then you set a bigger goal and you achieve it and so forth. So set those small, achievable, realistic goals. Don't be afraid, especially on rare studies, pediatrics as well, to say, maybe what we agreed to in the beginning, we're not able to achieve. It's okay to have those conversations, and it's okay for the situation to change. Be proactive. So it's really important to be proactive and be confident in discussing barriers. I guarantee you and can promise you, in fact, that if you do have a barrier and you're kind of like, oh, maybe I shouldn't mention this, it looks bad, don't be afraid. If you are experiencing that barrier, I promise you that there is someone else experiencing it as well. As I mentioned, it's always a trend. It's not if it'll ever happen, it's when it will happen. So be confident. Discuss your barriers, bring them to the attention of your study teams, to your site internally, and go back to having those brainstorms, those strategy sessions to think, we have this barrier, it seems impossible, what do we do next, okay? Again, think outside of the box. I would encourage the sites who are on the line today to think outside the box and to try something new. There has been countless times myself and my team has reported back to say, oh, the site doesn't want to do this activity. They don't want to use the doctor-to-doctor letter. They just don't like it. Okay, let's talk about why. Why do you feel that way? I think that sometimes it's about putting a little bit of pressure on to say, I understand you and I hear you, but if our normal methods, our tried and true methods are not working, let's try something new. Let's think outside of the box. Sometimes sites say, oh, well, we tried that 5 years ago and it didn't work. Okay, well, let's think about how it's changed and how we can freshen it up to make it work for your site. It's okay to take a new solution or an old solution and sort of move it around to make it fresh and spicy, to hopefully generate interest in your study and to also provide comfort to your site team. Something else on the proactive piece is developing study flowcharts. It's really easy to have a ton of studies to recruit for. I remember back when I was on site, I had 4 fibroid studies at one time. If you know anything about fibroid studies, they're very difficult and they include about 3 million steps along the way. So what we did is we created a flow chart to say, to basically break down if a patient were even eligible, and how they would fall in based on eligibility, and then basically from there how to explain the differences. So that's a good example of a flow chart, because it eases your mind on, if you have competing studies, how to deal with them, work off of eligibility, and then how to describe the risk and the benefits to the patient so that they can make that informed decision. But flowcharts also work with a patient recruitment and retention strategy. So you just create your little flowchart. We start here, we go here. That doesn't work, we come down here, and so forth. So always have a plan. A plan is better than no plan at all. And I guarantee you that if you have that plan, even if it might be difficult to create or make you a little uneasy, it will provide comfort along the way, because your steps are already determined, and you know that at any point in time you can kind of mix it up. You can be pivotal because it is not permanent, and you can change it as you move along. The last item here.
I'm so sorry. I'm cutting you off in your prime,
Okay.
I'm afraid. We have to turn to our questions now. And although I know whatever you're about to say was pure gold, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up there and save it for the next time. And the thing is, we've always got to allow people to want more. So it's a bit like a soap opera in that respect. Thank you very much to all our panelists for adding a lot of colour and detail to the new clinical trial landscape. So we're going to wrap things up now over the next 10 to 15 minutes with some questions. And I invite all our panelists to have a go at answering them. So let's start with this one. CEMs and trial redesign are predominantly there to engender trust, but how can they potentially accelerate a treatment's journey to market? Who'd like to take that question?
I can, that's fine. So I think that a CEM's involvement, if you will, on a study can definitely help a treatment journey to market. And the reason behind is because the CEM helps accelerate patient recruitment. So anything that a CEM provides, and as you've seen in my slides and Jane's as far as case studies, is that acceleration brings in those studies timelines to get that drug to market. And as we all know, that process is extensive. So anything that we can do to speed it up along the way is certainly helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. As a study coordinator, I don't have much time for patient recruitment. If I only have 5 minutes each day, what do you recommend I do? Who'd like to take that teaser?
I can take that one. One, absolutely, we understand that. I think, patient recruitment, the main thing to do is do something. And I think, as Whitney was kind of saying earlier, and if you've got 5 minutes, what can you do in that 5 minutes? So potentially maybe look through some charts, have a review of the patients that are coming in that day, just to see whether any of those patients could be potentially eligible. Speak to a colleague. Maybe there's an opportunity for internal referrals, and so actually speaking to a colleague, you'd actually kind of open up the patient population wider, or kind of potentially call another kind of external doctor as well. So maybe there's other people externally that could help you recruit patients. So the main thing is do something. I think, like Whitney said, 5 minutes is great. If that's all you've got, let's do something with those 5 minutes. And I think those 5 minutes can make a huge difference.
Yes, well said, Kate. Okay, next question. We currently have a rare disease study that is very challenging. Where do we get started to overcome our barriers and accelerate patient recruitment?
Well, I would say, because I work on the pre-award side, you really do have to identify what are going to be the biggest challenges and burdens to patients. We know that, especially at Parexel, that we really bring in the patient's voice into everything we do, from materials to the tools. So I think you really have to understand what the patient's life is like, what are going to be the needs. When sites are selected, again, we know if it's a difficult study, and I know, having been a CEM working with a lot of sites, those studies that are challenging are a lot of times because they have so many other studies that are coming in concurrently that they're working on. those that are hard to recruit for, or that they've been recruiting for a while, they stop recruiting for, simply because of the challenge of having to move on. So again, I just say that having those CEMs can really be beneficial, but you have to identify what is really going to be needed at the site and the patient level.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, next question. I think that the new landscape is a lot about transparency and collaboration. How can CEMs combine with public health institutions to maximize local knowledge? Whitney, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So, interestingly enough, one of my degrees is in public health, and I think it's important to recognize that local knowledge is unsurpassable. So, anything that a local, public health facility can, or like a health department, for example, can provide you as far as knowledge around the patient statistics that are perhaps not published, or even if you're thinking about certain disease areas and prevalence is something that you should absolutely tap into. I think the collaboration, though, also builds trust within the communities. So if you are working and if you have accessibility to a public health institution, being able to work on that partnership and say, hey, you know what, we're tackling this together. We're going to use our combined expertise, local and maybe research-based, putting them together to come up with the best formulated plan. And that exposure and partnership, it brings something bright and beautiful to a community full of people who might be okay with clinical trials, or maybe apprehensive, in fact. And just it reinforces the fact that it is for the good of the patient, and that partnerships truly do mean something. And I think that that just overall builds that trust relationship with the community that is needed.
Yes, well said, Whitney. Right, next question is all about seizing the zeitgeist, I think. How is CEM support utilized within decentralized trials?
Okay, I can make a start on that one. So I think what we're seeing from our side is that we're seeing very few 100% decentralized trials. What we're seeing is kind of the hybrid model. And so I think, with the hybrid model, obviously there's still sites. So the model is exactly the same. For decentralized, if they are 100% decentralized, we still have to find patients. And so where I think patient recruitment support can really help is, one, either through kind of digital advertising, two, through community outreach, so actually going out and talking to the patients, kind of where the patients are. So instead of hoping that they'll see an advert on a website, they actually go out and talk to patients as well. And that's something that we've been doing quite a lot, and actually did in COVID. So actually went out into communities, talked to not patients with COVID, but actually establishments where, it was actually kind of going into shops and putting information into kind of shop waiting rooms, things like that. So there's a huge opportunity with decentralized, but it is still quite kind of rare to see on our side 100% decentralized. Jane, I don't know if you've got anything else from PowerXL side of things.
I agree with that. I think each trial, when something is fully decentralized, there are different tools and tactics that you use. Site visits are very rare or infrequent in those. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is done by telehealth. I think, to your point, Kate, it really becomes then, because the sites aren't having as much interaction with patients, that it really does require that extra level of going out there and making that connection to find and identify those patients and make them aware that there are trials. Because, again, patients don't know what they don't know. And it is about education. And that's where CEMs are invaluable. I always say, that's what I really think of the E as part of that enrollment, is really clinical education managers, truthfully, because it's all about education.
Indeed it is. Thank you, Jane. And I don't know about you, everybody, but I love an acronym battle. So this leads me to the next question. What is the difference between a CRA and a CEM? A real teaser there, and I think I'm going to put that on Whitney's lap. Take it away, Whitney.
Sure. So you have to think about CRAs and what all they do. Okay. It's 100 things. They have so many different things to look after. And patient recruitment and retention is just one small little factor in their job responsibilities. So when a CRA oversees the site as a whole and the conduct, the data, answers questions about eligibility and the protocol, helps them with drug and lab supplies, you name it. A CEM only focuses on patient recruitment and retention. So in fact, we don't even touch clinical operations. We escalate actions and we work on behalf of the sites to find answers for them, because we like to say that, we're their support person. We will help you find answers. We'll make your life easier. But a CEM is focusing only on patient recruitment and retention to help sites with their struggles, their hurdles, to provide them solutions, then also to work through strategy.
Can I just add to that? Because, again, being a CM and working with CRAs, the focus is absolutely different, to your point, Whitney. And I would also say experience. Coming from a pharma background, I went through training to present to doctors, to present clinical information. Their focus is very, as I said, very different. Their experience is different. So, when I would go into sites, and what CMs do is, again, really talking to the sites about those challenges. A CRA goes in and it's all about documentation and making sure the study is, running a certain way and all the I's are, dotted and the T's are crossed. Very, very different roles.
Yeah, and it's really important to establish that distinction between the two. Thank you very much, panelists. I think we've got time for one more hot potato, which I'm going to throw among these good people. Could CEMs coordinate with online advertising companies to help bridge the gap between online lead referrals and actual site visits? Who's going to take that one?
I can start and then I'll let somebody else take over. So the one thing that came to mind when you just read this is that the best, meaning the most eligible and the most compliant patients, are going to come from a site's internal database. Now, that is not to say that if this is answering the question, and Jane, Kate, please add too, that absolutely sites and study coordinators and their teams, they do coordinate with online advertising agencies and platforms in order to basically recruit patients, and it does bridge the gap. It brings in additional patients and potential candidates. But I think as far as if you look at it, it is a supplemental recruitment strategy, but the primary should always be looking at the site's internal database. Jane?
Well, I will say that we do recommend central advertising, but again, back to, the challenges. You don't.
Ooh, I think we've got No, I think Jane has frozen in time.
Can you hear me? I think what happens is that, when you use central advertising and these referrals are coming in, you have to respond to those patients because they're calling in, and
Well, as I said earlier, always keep the audience wanting more. I think that's it from Jane. But thank you very much to our panelists, Whitney and Kate, and indeed.
Sorry.
Jane. It's all right, Jane. I think we're wrapping up now. I think we got the gist of what you were saying. So just let everybody know this video will be available online to stream. So when you finished watching your box set of Game of Thrones or people making cakes that look like tennis rackets, you can re-watch this presentation. So in the meantime, I hope we've given you a great deal to think about when it comes to clinical trial redesign, the new healthcare ecosystem, and indeed CEMs. I'm certainly thinking of becoming one myself. So thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and we hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.